All right. Accordingly, the U.S. and the Western nations ought to continue and intensify voluntary family planning assistance to the poor countries of the world. If truly non-coercive, such programs only provide options for poor families that rich families in the West already have, and they can help us geopolitically. One very good way to help assure that our values survive is to see it that they who will inherit the earth share these values. Remember, 100 years from now, probably only about 5 to 7% of the world's population will be the nation of the Western community. Accordingly, our foreign policy and that of our allies ought to become even more proselytizing than it is now. It ought to be aimed toward the development of what might be called a friendly geoculture. We should help cement Western values among the people of nations, now on the brink of both democracy and modernism. If we do that, the world of the future will be a more secure and friendlier place for us. This is a policy the U.S. has pursued for many years. It is inherent in the goals of agencies like the United States Information Agency, Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, Radio Marty, the Agency for International Development, and parts of many other larger government agencies, including the Department of State and Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, is a program specifically targeted for this purpose. It involves the participation of the AFL-CIO, the Chamber of Commerce, and both major political parties. The NED has sponsored programs all over the developing world to help establish free trade unions, to encourage free enterprise, to help free political processes flower, to encourage a free press and free religious institutions. Unfortunately, since its inception, it has been legislatively bashed and almost beheaded several times by coalitions of leftist liberals who think it is conservatively biased, and by conservatives who think it is tilted to be a liberal plan. It has been put on short rations by the Congress. Funding now runs at a measly total of $15 million per year. That amount should be dramatically increased. There is another sort of public diplomacy we might try. Our government might take the lead in convening an international conference of all free Western states that are facing the birth situation. After all, the United Nations has a population meeting every 10 years, but so far it has concentrated entirely on the population problems of the Third World. I was a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN Population Conference in 1984 in Mexico City, and hardly a public word was written or uttered about the low fertility difficulties of the free modern world. Probably because it's just creepy if you bring it up to, like, the UN or something, but whatever. A free world population conference would work towards several objectives. It would draw media attention from all over the world, particularly the birth nations. Remember, education and awareness come first. A suitable budget could be raised to commission definitive papers on what works and what doesn't in the realm of pronatalism. Perhaps the best thing that could come from such a conference would be the understanding that this problem does not just concern individual countries, but involves the entire modern world and its future. When people are aware that their problems are not unique, they are in a strong position to act. Cultural diplomacy is not only a government affair. For example, American and Western style businesses often spread our culture in a healthy way. Multinational corporations have carried the seeds of the market system to the corners of the world. Of particular importance is our movie and television industry. There are currently almost 150 million VCRs in the world, almost all manufactured in Japan. But most of the viewers are watching American cassettes. Moreover, most imported movies and television programs are American. Foreign designers have tried every dodge to limit their import to maintain local cultural purity. New trade legislation before the Congress in 1987 provides the president to be allowed to retaliate commercially against nations who limit market access to our movies, television programs, or cassettes. Such legislation should be enacted into the law, and the president should act when appropriate. What I find weird is that the economy right now is doing the pro-gay movement and everything else like that. So I wonder how much our lifestyles affect this person right now. Or, I'll speculate in another video, actually. That'll be for speculation. But, anyways. Cultural diplomacy is not only a government affair, for example. Oh, sorry. There is a reason to believe the Western political principles may be spreading. Example, since 1980, there have been almost 40 relatively free elections in 24 Latin American nations. That represents a high watermark for free elections in the history of the region. In the last 6 years, civilian presidents have replaced military rulers in Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, Honduras, Panama, Peru, Guatemala, El Salvador, Uruguay, and Brazil, and those nations to be the long-standing democracies in Colombia, Venezuela, and Costa Rica. And a remarkable fact emerges. Back in 1979, fully 2/3 of the nations in Latin America were under military or military-directed governments. Today, 90% of the Latin Americans live in countries that are democratic or well on the road to democracy. And American elections consultants, armed with 30-second television commercials, are going multinational with a Latin beat. That's good, not bad. Will these democracies take root and flourish? We do not know. There was some geopolitical euphoria in the 1960s when many Latin American nations moved in democratic directions, only to fall back. Still, the recent record is heartening, and we ought to act as if the Western thinking bloc can be expanded, not only in Latin America, but elsewhere. Accordingly, we ought to devote increased effort toward that end. More economic aid, astutely targeted to those countries interested in developing free market economies, free political process, free labor unions, and a free press would surely be of value. Military aid to Nicaragua, to Nicaraguans and other people seeking free government ought to be supported. A strong Western military establishment must be maintained to prevent communist expansion and adventurism, which, when successful, lead to a crushing of democratic values. Yeah, okay. Even if Western fertility should climb back to the replacement levels in the decades to come, the population of the Third World will be a much greater population of the world population than is now. Those Third World nations will likely be richer and more powerful than they are now. That is why, as mentioned, it is important to try to help them move toward a modernist and democratic future. But it is also why we better pay more attention to their concerns now. In the future, these nations will be our customers, our suppliers, and hopefully our allies. If they are not, we will likely be in trouble. Do we know enough about the Chinese and the Indians, Indonesians and Nigerians and Brazilians? Do we know enough even if our next door neighbors in Mexico? Do we know their language? Do we know their cultures? We ought to. These are the demographic superpowers of the next century. Surely, we want them to look toward Western values as they grow. Just as surely, that is more likely to happen if we are regarded as a sympathetic power, willing to listen and learn, if not necessarily always willing to heed. Another important step down the road to long-term population stability would be the Western nations to step up their acceptance of legal immigration. For political reasons, that is the most unlikely to happen in the ethnically homogeneous nations of Japan and Western Europe. It would seem to be politically plausible, but still difficult in the United States. Now that the attempt has been made to curb illegal immigration with employer sanctions legislation, we should push for legal immigration. This will be an uphill fight. Recall that the 1986 bill passed in large measure because legislators who favored immigration feared that if the bill didn't pass in its current form, we would end up getting one even more restrictive we would end up getting more restrictive. Alright. Here is how the New York Times and the Washington Post described what went on behind the scenes. Quote, hold on. Members of the Congress and staff aides such that a major force for members of the Congress and staff aides said that a major force for passage came from constituents who called the lawmakers after the bill's September 26 defeat, talked about their fears of increasing violence, drugs, and crime along the Mexican-American border, and said it was time to do something about illegal immigration. Another factor was a fear by congressional proponents such as Representative Peter W. Rodino Jr., DNJ, and Charles E. Schumer, DNY, and if the bill were not enacted this year, it would come back later in the more repressive form. Wow. Jeez. Oh, Washington Post, October 11th, 1986. End quote. In the past, oh shit, no, not, end quote, sorry, continuing the quote. In the past, Hispanic Americans, including members of the Congress, denounced the immigration bill because they said it would encourage employers to discriminate against Hispanic workers. But on Thursday, 4 Hispanic members of the House voted for the bill. In general, they said they feared that any immigration bill in the future Congress would be even more restrictive. So I've always heard from my old neighbor back in the day where I used to live, like, she had immigrant parents, and she said something interesting, you know, with the infighting of immigrants who want to be catered to but push away other immigrants because they think that they're stealing their place or job or whatever. Like, her parents were very, like, raw and, like, nasty kind of towards the idea of other immigrants coming. So it was interesting hearing that anecdotal thing. Pretty sure not all immigrant native people who used to be immigrants or whatever and now have a family generation in America, pretty sure they're not all xenophobic. It's just when it comes to family values, it seems like our pro-life over here loves to instigate the family values of people who are trying to make a life over here with families and such. So, of course, conservatives would adore immigration if it wasn't for the fact that, oh, they're brown, oh, it looks bad, oh, so they'll make up any excuse. Not just the immigrants that are here, but just the Anglo people and people considered white that get to have a say. They just make up all sorts of excuses. Anyways, in fact, we still may get immigration rollbacks precisely because Americans are anti-immigration. Yet a fight for more legal immigration is legislative combat worth the effort. Moderately increased legal immigration could alleviate, although not wholly solve, some of the economic and public geopolitical aspects of the birth dearth. Problems discussed here, as noted earlier, this would be less socially disruptive and accordingly more politically plausible if it occurred while the fertility rates of existing Americans were climbing back toward the replacement rate away from the birth dearth levels. In any event, it would be useful to set to rest for once and for all the economic simplistic notion that immigrants take away jobs from natives. They don't. Immigrants, at the same time, also create markets and other jobs. Okay, so that's on page 165, by the way. I didn't know he said it twice in the book. That's good. Alright. The Real Solution, Chapter 13, Spirit. Now, this is where it gets twisted, in my opinion. And I'll explain, kind of, in a separate video. An author often becomes obsessed by the thesis of the book he is working on. His Johnny One-Note ear is attuned to everything he reads, hears, or sees that has any relevance to his topic, and he also notes the significance of things he does not hear. In late 1986, I attended a large dinner in Washington given by the Ethics and Public Policy Center. The honoree was William F. Buckley, Jr., who gave an interesting address. A major speech was delivered by President Reagan. Short toasts were offered by Jeane Kirkpatrick, Ronald Rumsfeld, and Neil Nitz. The substance of the speechifying boils down to this. There is a great global struggle going on. The future of liberty is at stake. Hold on. Western values are under challenge. We do not yet know the outcomes of this struggle. Strong military budgets were advocated. Star Wars was endorsed. Reagan doctrine assertiveness in Nicaragua. Angola, Afghanistan, and Cambodia was applauded. Frail, stripped pants, cookie pusher, State Department types were by implication denounced as not fully aware of the dangers of the hostile world. As it happens, I agree with much, not all, of that point of view about the nature and proper role of American foreign policy. But as I sat there that night, I was thinking about what I was not hearing. In my judgment, the major threat to Western values in the free world concerns the fact that as the next century progresses, there won't be many free Westerners around to protect and promote those values. But American conservatives have not taken up this cause in a serious public way. To my ear, that night, the silence was deafening. Okay. I definitely hear conservatives talking a lot lately about their values being stripped. So someone has pushed this narrative. I feel like there's conservatives and pushback against the bottom all the time, but it's just coincidental, I guess. Also in 1986, the Reagan administration issued a long-awaited task force reportedly titled The Family, Preserving America's Future. It dealt with welfare reform, taxation, education, divorce, poverty, illegitimacy, and adoption, among other things. Although it had a harsh liberal bashing tonality to it, a number of recommendations were quite sound. Some of them resemble some ideas listed in this book, but for a report aimed at preserving America's future, it is interesting not that there was no mention of any plan, program, or idea that was related specifically to the idea of raising fertility levels in this below replacement nation of ours. Mind you, some of the programs endorsed had no proto-natal effects. But that was not the rationale offered. These Reaganauts were pro-family all right, but apparently afraid of the political repercussions of coming out in favor of more of that of which families are made. Children. The liberals are just so bad. The liberals are just as bad. They propose many programs to make it easier for women to have children. That is fine and pro-natalist. But the rationale offered for such programs never concerns the idea that below replacement fertility rates are a problem in and of themselves. Too many liberals are still hung up on the idea that people are polluters, but they are also producers and providers, vote for clean water bills and pro-natalist policies, and they are not in conflict. More people provide the funds for more pollution control. And we're kind of not doing that, but whatever. I think we actually did sign a climate bill recently, but I haven't looked into it. Anyways, this avoidance of pronatalism for its own sake is not common to the political commercial democracies of Western Europe, perhaps because their birth rates and immigration rates are generally lower than ours, as it is least politically acceptable to bring up the topic and propose remedies, although most typically the remedies suggested are not nearly commensurate with the magnitude of the problem they face. Jeez. In the U.S., everyone is for a family policy. Everyone is for taking better care of children, and hardly a soul can be heard endorsing the idea of more children. And yet I believe that may be our major long-term problem, both domestically and as a leader of the Alliance of Free Nations. On this issue, the American eagle is an ostrich. It is about time we paid attention. One of the very few modern countries in this world that has a fertility rate substantially above replacement value is Israel. The Israel TFR among the Jewish population is 2.7. A bit of this stems from the very high birth rates among ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist Jews, but even discounting that, it is very high by Western standards. It is high from among Jews from both European and Oriental backgrounds, and Israel's Jewish fertility rate is almost twice as high as that from Jews living elsewhere. Why? Israel is not a perfect country by any means. Indeed, it is racked by internal dissent external threats, a staggering economy, a huge debt, and migration. Yet fertility is high. Why is this? Is there a lesson here for us? I think in a general way, perhaps there is. My sense is that Israel's fertility is high for two intertwined reasons: pride and fear. For all their problems, most Israelis are proud of their beleaguered state and the transcendental mission they believe it has to provide a well-populated Jewish homeland. Transcendental mission. Okay. And Israeli parents are afraid. 5 major wars, other smaller conflicts, and terrorism have taken their toll on young Israeli men. Every time there is a war, Israeli soldiers get killed. About 2,500 men were lost in the 1973 war with Egypt and Syria. The parents of the dead soldiers grieve. Then many other parents think, maybe we'd better have another child, just in case in the future we lose our son. Obviously, this phenomenon cannot be measured, but it may well be that for every soldier killed in war, scores of new babies are conceived for personal insurance. Pride and fear. These intertwined elements should be present in our own demographic equation as well. We have something to fear and something to be proud of. As I reflect upon our situation, it seems that despite all the plans and schemes advanced earlier, the real and lasting solution to our dilemma is not finally to be found in the realm of politics, the tax code, or the immigration code. Our central problem is in the realm of spirit. For in the last analysis, it is our spirit that shapes our politics, our tax code, and immigration code. If our young people remain a generation that can be characterized as me-oriented or self-actualizing, they probably will continue to have fewer children. But suppose we re-inspirited this generation to understand and take pride in the fact that they are part of a remarkable, potent, productive, humane, beneficent culture. Suppose our young people in America and other Western nations came to know in the marrow of their bones that the West is, as Lincoln said, the last best hope of mankind. Suppose it was explained that only they can preserve it and that there is something real or to fear if they don't. If such a spiritual rekindling process actually takes place among our young people, reacting to both pride and fear, it might bolster a civilization that has been a long time in the building. After all, it's not such a big deal. All it involves is having another baby. I began this book saying it was a speculation. I end it that way too. It is a speculation based on trends in motion, trends hard to reverse. Upon examination and reflection, it should be clear what we have every reason to be concerned about, the portents these trends may yield. And we should try to do something about it. And that's the end of that. So it almost sounded like population management with the help of useful idiots that aren't looking out, that have no connection to the population management. They do little pushes and policies to get the people on the bottom rung of the policymakers that really probably aren't fully aware of what's going to happen, that these people are planning behind their backs. So what if we're like in infrastructure turmoil and constantly in a 20-year war, because that's going to be the Israeli model that we, or this guy at least, claims would help for the fertility rate? That is crazy. Like, I don't even want to be that conspiratorial about it, but he's been saying so much shit back and forth with, we can't coerce, it's a democracy, but if we have to and it comes down to it, then we must, that's basically what it is. Alright, and the appendix is page 170 to 178. Alright, see ya.